Hello everyone, bom dia and good afternoon. For those of you who survived the first week, congratulations. For those of you who have just arrived, it's nice having you here and a warm welcome to the Singapore Pavilion here at COP30 in Belem. Thank you for joining us for this important session, Flood and Coastal Resilience in Southeast Asia, from Shared Evidence to Collective Action. So Southeast Asia is one of the world's most arguably vulnerable regions when it comes to sea level rise, storm surges and flooding. So these challenges continue to threaten lives, infrastructure and economies across all 11 ASEAN countries. At the same time, regional responses remain fragmented and there is clearly a need for stronger coordination, shared data and practical action that can scale across borders. Today's session aims to bring visibility to Southeast Asia's climate resilience priorities and to highlight the region's leadership, expertise and potential to shape globally relevant solutions. To begin, we will play a short video introducing SEAPAW, the Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water, a platform launched in collaboration with the World Economic Forum to strengthen water resilience as a core pathway for climate adaptation across the region.
Water. It sustains us. But today, water is also at the heart of our planet's greatest challenges. Fiercer storms, extreme floods, severe droughts. Yet, in the face of these challenges, we find hope in our ability to adapt and to take action together. This is the mission of SEAPAW, the Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water.
We've got to contribute to tackling the problem through domestic policy change, by shaping capital markets, by mobilizing all stakeholders, and by joining together internationally.
Led by the Singapore International Foundation, in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, this movement is a call to action for change.
SEAPAW will bring together and convene stakeholder groups to co-curate and co-develop workable solutions to address real issues on the ground.
Enabling collaborative solutions tailored to our region's unique water-related challenges.
Here in Southeast Asia, we are the most vulnerable. We can see this happening in all our major cities. Flooding, droughts, wildfire, climate has already changed. And therefore, human civilization has no choice but to adapt.
SEAPAW allows us to elevate this conversation to the point where we can involve decision makers that have the power to try new things.
To advance water adaptation in agriculture, urban planning, and nature conservation. To build climate resilience in Southeast Asia. To change the course for a more equitable and sustainable water future. A future where water once again flows with promise and possibility.
SEAPAW is seeing adaptation and water as a solution space. Bringing those two together can show the world that what needs to be done also can be done.
Join us as we turn the tide. SEAPAW. Water finds a way, and so will we.
All right, I hope that video gives a little bit of understanding and context for today's session. And to help us set the stage, I would now like to invite Christie Lee, Director of Programs at the Singapore International Foundation, to share more about SEAPAW, its working groups, and the key developments since its launch. Christie will also speak about the growing impacts of floods in Southeast Asia and how these challenges led to the development of the Flood Damage Reduction Roadmap. Christie, please.
Thank you, MJ. A very good afternoon to everyone and a warm welcome to the Singapore Pavilion. It gives me great pleasure to be here today to welcome you to SEAPAW's session on flood and coastal resilience in Southeast Asia. As part of COP26 in Glasgow, countries agreed to ensure commitments on adaptation and loss and damage are honoured, and 2025 was identified as a timeframe for doubling adaptation finance. Here we are in 2025, and I do not think this goal is likely to be met. And without a clear post-2025 target, there is a risk that progress could stagnate. We have heard how this year is a COP of implementation and adaptation, and SEAPAW is exactly that response. The Singapore International Foundation has long championed regional collaboration and people-to-people partnerships, and we launched SEAPAW in June 2024 with the World Economic Forum as our knowledge partner to advance climate resilience in Southeast Asia through a water-centered approach. SEAPAW aims to bring together public, private, and civic actors to turn shared challenges into actionable, investable solutions that are locally grounded, regionally aligned, and globally relevant. Climate action has long been seen as the responsibility of governments, but it is clear that without other actors, especially the private sector and businesses, stepping up to also take action, we are not going to get very far in our efforts to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Since SEAPAW's launch, 25 organizations across different sectors, including academia and research, finance, technology, and non-profits, have joined us, and we count the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, Boston Consultant Group, Google Asia Pacific, Microsoft, Mei For Luang Foundation, Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, Temasek Life Sciences Laboratory, and Thrive Networks East Meets West, among others, as members and affiliates. In June this year, a joint paper developed together with the forum in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group was published to introduce the concept of adaptation through water, an approach that places water at the very center of climate adaptation discussions. Southeast Asia is already among the most vulnerable regions to extreme weather, and overall, Southeast Asian countries could lose 18 to 25% of our GDP due to climate change. This region needs to prepare quickly for the impacts of climate change, and yet these efforts are under-prioritized and under-supported. And a major reason for the lack of support is the difficulty in grasping adaptation. To that end, this paper describes a framework for action focusing on 4 key solution areas that can drive tangible impact. Flood damage reduction, which is safeguarding people, infrastructure, and ecosystems from escalating flood risk. Water optimization and circularity, which is improving the efficiency and reuse across agriculture and industry. Financing adaptation through water, which means mobilizing capital for high-impact projects, and water and nature innovation, scaling technologies and nature-based solutions. Following the report, SEAPAW members committed to forming working groups to try and look at possible roadmaps to accelerate action in these areas. And today, we would like to share conversations from the Flood Damage Reduction Working Group formed to identify local-level pathways for resilience and increasing private sector demand signals. The business opportunities in these areas are substantial, but to unlock the financing, we need a coordinated, investable, and inclusive agenda that aligns evidence, policy, and finance. I'm very pleased to invite Dave Sivaprasad, a member of the working group, to moderate this session. Dave leads the BCG's climate and sustainability practice in Southeast Asia and climate adaptation and resilience in Asia Pacific, and recently published a number of pieces on climate resilience as a strategic priority and the enabling environment needed to attract investment to drive lasting change. I will leave the very important discussion and what this roadmap could look like to Dave and our esteemed panel here today to discuss why we believe a collective approach is so urgent. Dave, please.
Thank you, Christie, for the very kind introduction. And it is, on behalf of BCG, it's a privilege for us to be part of this partnership and contribute to this important agenda in Southeast Asia. So as Christie mentioned, there are a number of working groups that sit behind these themes that are looking to advance how we address these issues, mobilize more private sector, and ultimately then more resources and funding and financing that need to go into these measures that are much needed in our part of the world. So why flooding is on this list? It is it's a problem that we face today, and it's a severe problem, right? So historic impact, 2 billion in terms of US dollars of impact every year has been what we've been seeing historically. Now we know that the future is not a representation of the past, so this is only going to get worse. And if I draw attention to that 1.7 times, that's a global number of that's how much flooding frequency and severity has increased globally. And our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we are one of the most exposed to climate impact. So it would be no stretch of the imagination if we expect this to be worse than the global average. And I'll be remiss if not to comment on the huge number of fatalities that we have experienced over the last 30 years. So 200,000 people have lost their lives directly or indirectly through flooding. So this is a really big problem. So how does SEAPAW come in? And as Christie mentioned, the intention of SEAPAW is to create platforms for engagement, convening. It is a problem, as with many aspects of adaptation, where it is everyone's problem, but no specific player's problem, right? So it is one that has a huge need for coordination, a huge need for aligning various incentives, and it also is bringing together different actors in the system, so public and private in particular in adaptation. And just some background numbers to this. Historically, flood management has been a big problem in Southeast Asia. We've managed it. We've managed it with primarily 90% of public sector investment. So this is governments and taxpayers paying for flood protection. If you look at the increase of the incidence of flood that we expect, and BCG did some analysis on this, on forward estimates on adaptation across various issues and government budgets, very often, the number is 3, 5, 10x in terms of the difference of what is needed and what governments have. So when you start putting that into the forward view of what we're going to deal with, you need all forms of resource and investment to flow in to deal with this issue. And private sector, particularly domestic private sector, plays a key role in managing these issues. So what does then the working group do? The working group, the intention is to set up a roadmap as a basis for convening, for engagement, for activation, to create an environment for the potential coordination amongst actors to invest and act behind what is needed in flooding. So we certainly, and Christie mentioned this, we need local solutions, context specific, and we need pathways where private sector can see the returns that they are investing against, whether that's value protection or potentially incremental value in some areas. So maybe just to wrap it up, the intention is to have this roadmap over the next year. Next year it will be released with a working group as a basis for convening, and the intention is to bridge between public and private. So if I maybe describe it in these terms, large corporates and private businesses are actually quite good at managing their risks, but within their fence line, right? They're quite good at doing that. Public sector takes care of public good, right? So, we have big projects that public sector will invest and finance, and infrastructure is certainly a part of the solution. There is a gray area in between where you need solutions that may not be the massive irrigation or the flood protection. You may need something that is, more fit for purpose, bespoke, flood barriers, flood pumps, what have you, that sit in that center that, it's too small for the public sector to manage, and they don't have the resource, and it's beyond the fence line of the private sector. So what do you do with that? These are the areas, as an example, where this working group is intending to mobilize the actors to find these points of intersection where you could collaborate and invest and get these solutions on the ground. So that's the intent, and we will as a working group, release this. We have a fantastic panel lined up to discuss flood protection in greater detail and the various aspects of this complex problem. Let me introduce the panel. Let me start first with Amy Barnes, who's the head of Climate and Sustainability Strategy at Marsh. Amy, welcome. Calvin Chong, who's the Divisional Director for Energy and Climate Policy for the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment. Welcome, Calvin. Professor Goh, who's the Faculty of Built Environment in the Universiti of Malaya. Welcome. And we have Rueban Manokara, who's a global lead for carbon finance and markets with the WWF. Welcome all.
Great. It's a privilege to have you here on this panel, and you bring such a diverse perspective, nature, communities, public, private, and certainly the private sector. So we wanted to start with a really broad question, just to get us going, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper. And it's been your initial thoughts when you think about flooding and how that risk manifests itself. What comes to mind? And maybe Amy, starting with you.
I'm not sure I can be brief. I'll try really hard. So the first thing when I think about flooding, I also think about scarcity. I think we need to recognize that everywhere that floods is also very vulnerable to drought. That's not the topic of this panel, but I think it's something we need to be really aware of, and the private sector is. I do work in the private sector, and I work in the insurance industry. And so when we think about flood, we think about the potential to cause damage. And how do we make sure that assets are insurable both now and in the future? But when I then put an ASEAN lens on that, we have very low insurance penetration in ASEAN. About, I have to check my numbers, 4% penetration in ASEAN. That compares to the global average of 7%. But in the UK, in an economy that relies on insurance very heavily, it's 14%. So 4% versus 14% is really low. And so insurance provides people with economic resilience. If you build your house, it's easier to make that investment if you know that if the worst happens, you'll be able to rebuild it. And the majority of people in the ASEAN region don't have that financial resilience following a flood. But I could do another 4 hours, so I'll pause there.
Thank you, Amy. Calvin.
I can't help but wear my government hat here. And so when you think about, when you mention flooding, what's the role of government, and what is the role of government to protect public health, public safety, land values, property, the long-term safety and security of people's livelihoods, of people's property? They all come into play. And so that is first and foremost my worry, right? And second, following on from that is then what is government's role once we have a proper understanding of, say, those kinds of impacts on what I just described? What is government's role to play to mobilize action? How much should we pay? How much should we involve the private sector and the people sectors to come on board? I think these are all very weighty questions. And each of us in our own communities and in our own countries are grappling with this because there's no playbook. And we feel the ground shifting as we speak because of climate change impacts, of increasing intensity of rainfall. So I think these are difficult issues that we all have to grapple with. And maybe I look forward to learning a bit more from my very distinguished panel members on how then each of us have a part to play to really answer some of these questions.
Thank you, Calvin. Professor Goh?
Is it? Can you hear? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So, being trained as an urban planner, then tourism planner, then in geography, and also like doing a lot of work now, right, in the domain of like interdisciplinary, as a social scientist, how I see flood is always about the damage, the harms, right, to the communities. That is something that right, immediately come to my mind. But again, like I mentioned earlier, I was trained in urban planning. Then it's also right associated closely to how well our cities has been planned. Yeah, rapid urbanization, especially when we talk about Southeast Asia region, and at the same time, the fragmented governance. I think that is the key issues that right, we are addressing when we talk about flood. In the past is that we always have area where is too much of water, there comes the names of flood, and then we have like too little water, there comes the issue of when we talk about droughts. Eventually is that by what we realize in academia is that we need to integrate what we have been doing, all the efforts, right, to become one ecosystem so that right, we can make the max and the optimum level to address right, the flood issue.
Thank you. Rueban?
Thanks, Dave. And before I start, just want to say thank you to SIF and the Singapore Pavilion for having me on this panel. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. So coming from WWF, and because of the panda is a strong brand, people tend to associate pandas with biodiversity and animals. But what is not often known is that in the heart of everything that we do in WWF is community first. And so building on the point made by Prof, when I think about floods and flood-induced damages, the first things that come to mind is the impact to communities. And I don't just mean the direct impact to communities in terms of what happens because of a flood. And I think in the context of Southeast Asia, since the tsunami, there's been huge improvements in dealing with disasters, in dealing with humanitarian disasters. But there's also the indirect impact of floods, right? And the long-term impacts of floods that is equally important and that has impacts on communities. And just to share a story, so I recently was in Indonesia visiting coastal communities, and due to the sea level rise, but also more frequent floodings, there has been damage to mangroves. And because there was damage to the mangroves, the coastal communities and fisher folk have seen a drop in their catch, in their yields, in their livelihoods. And these are not just one-off impacts. These are impacts that are going to compound year on year, but ultimately they impact the livelihood of communities. And I think that needs to be addressed as well when we talk about dealing with the impacts of floods and building resilience against these climate impacts.
Thank you, Rueban. And all four of you touched on, different vantage points, very important aspects of a very complex problem. So I'm going to zoom out a bit, and Calvin, I'm going to go to you because, from the standpoint of government, as you described, you look at the macro picture, right? And you look across all the impacts that every constituent in the economy, in society faces. How is the government thinking about getting the system to mobilize around it? And are there specific policy shifts that you're evaluating or thinking about or already being put in place that are catalytic to that shift?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's a very important question. Maybe I'll answer it in a few ways. First and foremost, we need to understand the science of this. So that means, how does climate change impact weather, and more importantly, long-term weather patterns in whatever region you're concerned with? So Singapore, we have what we call the V3 climate study. We took the latest AR6 findings, downscaled that to about a 80-meter resolution, and applied it to Singapore and the region. That gives us a better understanding, based on certain reasonable projections, in the worst case scenario, what to expect in 2100. So what came out of that was potential temperature rises of up to 4 or 5 degrees based on the urban heat effect. It also meant sea level rise of up to 5 meters. So that's twice my height. So you can imagine around our coastlines, and Singapore is a very tiny island, smaller than the city of London, only a few times the size of Manhattan, and multiply that with what we see are these science-based projections on what that might mean for rainfall, what that might mean for sea level rise, then that gives us a picture of what to expect and what to plan for. So that's my first point. We need to understand the science of this and make sure it's grounded in robust, peer-reviewed, internationally recognized standards and projections and assumptions, because that's how government should plan. And we need to defend to the public what are those planning parameters. Secondly, based on the science of this, then we can properly map out what are the possible impacts to the country, be it damage, be it loss of property, and it's staggering. So because I mentioned Singapore as an island, if you map the 5-meter sea rise, up to a third of our island will be underwater by 2100 if we don't do anything. So I guess many of us in the room, you might have heard about how the Pacific Island states have a very similar issue. Singapore is no different. And so when you realize the magnitude of that issue, then you have to apply your minds to then how do you seriously then start to think about how you need to mobilize resources, how you need to look at technologies, you start to look at good examples from other countries who may have dealt with a similar issue, but of a different scale perhaps, or a different context. And that requires you to apply your mind to what can we do now, and what might we need to hold off and do slightly later? What might we need to do as a government? And what we might need the private sector and the people sector to come on board. Because infrastructure and seawalls can only go so much. It requires a human response. Singaporeans are not used to seeing extensive flooding in their homes and at the
wave heights, and when you think of Singapore, there are not that many places which are over 5 meters, unfortunately. So you really do need to think about the whole system. And in that spirit, and also picking up Rueban from what you're saying, I'm going to go to you, Prof Goh. So we're going to think about it as a system, right? Where many things need to line up for true resilience and adaptive capacity. What are some of the overlooked aspects of this when you put a lens on the communities that are impacted, both in terms of planning and executing the actions that are needed? What do you see?
If we take a look on what happened today, we are not only talking about cities, but in Malaysia, for instance, according to the National Physical Info, by 2040, we'll have 80% of Peninsula Malaysia will be urbanized, meaning that apart from the mountain ranges, all the areas will be urbanized. So now we are talking about urban areas then. What has been overlooked is that when we talk about flood, in a way, we are planning and design for hazard, but we forgot about the people who live with the hazard every day. They are the ones that dealing with it then. And at the moment is that based on a more top-down planning approach, this is being overlooked then. One thing is that in many Southeast Asian countries, mainly developing countries, what has been overlooked when we talk about the community, when we talk about the people that living in an urban area or even in cities, is that we always focus on maybe owners, or we say the residents. But among the residents, there are many, many groups. It's very diverse groups among them. One is the rentals, the tenants. What happens when we talk about flood? What happens to the tenants? The loss of the properties, one thing. But how about all the, we say about, let's say, right, in the house, the cars, that's one. Second is that, right, in this region also, we see a lot of migrants. What happened to them? Yeah, this has been, right, in a way, has been overlooked, as well as the informal sectors and informal, right, settlers as well, which is, right, very high when it comes to the population's, right, percentage, right, in this region. This has been, in a ways that need to be given, right, more emphasis. Yeah, to be part of the systems that, but the system is at the moment is that I think what we have to kind of, like, stretch the spectrums a bit to include all these, right, different groups of people. That this diverse group of people need to be included. And again, like I mentioned earlier, is that, right, we plan for hazard, but we forgot about to plan for the people who actually dealing with the hazard. And then if you take a look on the hazard itself, flood. When we plan for flood modeling, for instance, we think about, okay, we would like to evacuate people. Then we're also thinking that by during the evacuation, there are people that, right, do not want to be evacuated or even relocated. Yeah, that's first. How many of them that do not want to be relocated, especially when we talk about sea level rise? Sea level rise, we are talking about coastal communities, and coastal communities, we have a coastal area or coastal region where you see, right, these luxurious housing areas or coastal cities or the waterfronts. But at the same time, we also have fishing villages. And then those are the vulnerable groups then. Where they are going to go? They have no place to go because that is tied, right, to their livelihood options. So those are the things that need to be seen as a system. We have that system, but it is not, right, rich enough, right, to capture the needs and also the different expectation or even, right, the basic rights of the peoples that are living in this region.
Thank you, Professor Goh. It really speaks to top-down planning, but locally led adaptation, right? And connecting up these two in an effective way. And the second point on context really matters, right? It reminds me of a story that one of your colleagues from Malaysia shared, where a community that was facing a lot of flooding. The feedback from the community was, we face flooding all the time. We actually know how to deal with this, but we don't know how to deal with heat. Right? So really, what is the problem that the community needs to solve, and being able to then organize around that as a really important point. Going to shift gears a bit to the economy and private sector, in particular businesses. Amy, how are you seeing, with all the incidences of extreme events and high frequency events that we've observed over the last 1 or 2 years? How are you seeing the shift, if any, of businesses on how they're evaluating these risks, how they are pricing it, and how they are factoring it into their commercial decision making?
So I'm going to come back to something that Kelvin said about, we have hazard models for Asia. So we broadly understand how the hazard will change over time. Because we have relatively low insurance penetration, what we don't have is good vulnerability maps. So in insurance, we'd worry about the vulnerability. So you look at the hazard, you'd look at the type of asset, and you'd think, how vulnerable is that to the hazard? And so you need to know the building type, you need to know the elevation. And the insurance community has not invested in the quality of vulnerability data that it has in the US or in Europe. And so we have much less data in the region than elsewhere. And the reason that's so important is because I wrote down the words that were on the slide that you put up. We have limited data to justify investment. Because without understanding the specific vulnerability, it's very difficult to give a cost benefit for an intervention that reduces the vulnerability. So if I were in an ecosystem where that vulnerability was well understood, it's relatively straightforward for us to say that your vulnerability, let's talk in dollar terms, your vulnerability is currently 10. With more extreme weather, that's going to become 17. If you take this action, you can get your vulnerability down to a 9 in terms of dollars. And then people can make a cost-benefit decision. They can understand, they can think about planning that CapEx into their operating cycle. If we can't monetize the cost of the risk, it's very hard for the private sector to justify the investment. So we need to improve the vulnerability data sets within the region. But I think it's also really important. I always feel bad in the private sector, the fact I talk about assets first. People clearly matter hugely, but even if I go back to assets, assets don't create value, it's the people in the assets. So having workforces protected is very important to employers as well. And Professor Goh and I were talking before we came on the panel about the 2011 Thai floods. Now, a woman in my team was living in Thailand at the time she was at school. And so she tells me about, even though the Bangkok floods were quite devastating, the city had invested in protection for the industrial zone in order to maintain and protect foreign direct investment, which meant that the houses were the ones that bore the brunt of the suffering. Well, that's also a problem for business, just being very sort of cut and dried about it, because they need workers to be healthy and to be able to focus on going to work. So companies are not ignoring the social implications of flooding. The last point I'll make that companies are really increasing their focus on is the risk in their supply chain. And ASEAN is a supply chain of so many parts of the world. This isn't an ASEAN example, but about 3 weeks ago, a large motor manufacturer in the US posted a $1.5 billion loss because of flooding at their aluminium manufacturer, which meant they couldn't make one of their flagship vehicles. And so as we look at so much of the automotive industry being dependent on Vietnam in their supply chain, which has very high level of flood exposure, we have more companies assessing the risk of vulnerability in their supply chain. Now, the concern I have for those cities is, and sorry for being quite detailed on this, but I think it's a really important point for governments, is if we're just looking at hazard data, we can say the hazard is getting worse. I think that the risk in Vietnam is too high. I'm going to withdraw my foreign direct investment. If the Vietnamese government can't communicate or doesn't communicate what they're doing to reduce the vulnerability, then that has a massive economic consequence that may not be felt until decisions that can't be reversed have already been made. So we really need to get beyond just communicating the hazard and really a focus on vulnerability, which I think you agree with.
Thank you, Amy. I would love to come back to you later on what the barriers are to getting a good understanding of vulnerability and certainly dive deeper into that blind spot of the supply chain. Rueban, we talk a lot about infrastructure when we talk about flood management. We also know that nature plays an enormous role in building adaptive capacity in a system. Maybe two questions for you. One, how do we better integrate nature into adaptation programs, portfolios of projects that need to be done? And, what are some encouraging examples that you're seeing where this is happening?
So, and you're absolutely right. So, coming from a conservation organization, the starting point is there a nature-based solution to the problem? But a key enabler, as you highlighted, Dave, is it can only be a solution if it is also a cost-effective solution, right? So, we've got to take a very practical approach to that. And in one example, I'm sure Kelvin can shed more about it, is the example that Singapore took in terms of creating nature in its canals, right? So instead of expanding concrete drains so that they are bigger and you spend more money building the physical infrastructure, what Singapore has done in one of the biggest parks in Singapore, the Ang Mo Kio Bishan Park, is to convert the concrete canal into a nature-based waterway. And the effect of that was to deal better with increased flooding increased rainfall and the increased capacity needed. But the actual cost of doing that was about half the cost that it would have cost if you had built a physical infrastructure. And that's in leveraging the power of nature, right? And that's how natural ecosystems work. You have watersheds, and they have a role to play in dealing with natural disasters, right? But the starting point is we need informed planners, and we need to build capacity not only in Singapore, but in many other countries to consider nature-based solutions as a viable solutions, because in many cases it can be a equally viable, if not a more cost-effective solution than physical infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you, Rueban. That's a great example, and the value case for that is indisputable, right? If you have half the cost and that gives you the same outcome, it becomes an easy case for government and also where possible private sector. As an aside, we've seen some case examples where this is where some pathways for private sector might be interesting, where because you've greened the area, the real estate price has increased, so the asset value has gone up, right? So there's a private sector incentive that is yet to be tapped, but maybe there's potential there as well. Fantastic. Kelvin, I'm gonna pick up from Amy on the supply chain question, because I think it demonstrates the nature of how different actors in the system, either in a value chain or where they're complementary and adjacent, they face the issue, and it's in their interest to act and do something about it, right? And very often it's difficult for these disparate players to self-organize. How do you see these partnerships or coordination mechanisms, or what we may call them, how do you see these evolving, and where do you see the critical role of government in being able to establish some of these?
Well, I think of it in a few ways, right? So one, I think, as earlier mentioned, providing data is for sure an important platform. Be it, we call it climate projections, but if there's more data that's needed to be shared with financiers or insurers for them to crowd in financing in order to fund mitigation projects or adaptation projects, nature-based projects, I think that's something that governments need to think a bit deeper about and shouldn't be allergic to in the first instance. So I think that's the first point that we make, that governments, we understand we hold a lot of data. It's also a matter of how much to release, how much to share with wider industry. And I would like to believe it can be two-way, that perhaps as part of that shared platform, other players, both private or even universities, can also put in their data in that shared repository. I think that's a quite powerful way to make sure that we plug that data gap that we mentioned earlier, so that both public and private players have a better understanding of the risks and perhaps also map out the vulnerabilities. So that's one point. But I would like to think that in the private sector, there are many associations and who organize themselves by domains. I work on climate mitigation and policy, but I work very closely with my Monetary Authority of Singapore colleagues when we talk about adaptation financing, because I cannot come up with a national adaptation plan that talks about managing rising sea levels and potential impacts on supply chains, on companies, without having a conversation with my finance colleagues on what kinds of data is needed. How do we address very real issues in the financing space when it comes to scale, when it comes to bankability, when it comes to insurability? I think these are questions that I need to pose to my colleagues who work in the finance space to get a better understanding. And then I will have a better way to plug or at least address some of these gaps that they might see. So I think from a domain perspective, I would pretty much lean towards, say, also the building and infrastructure companies who have a better understanding of what kinds of solutions, like technology innovations, are out there to address flooding, to address heat, that actually governments have a role to play to help scale. If there's a private sector solution, and I was speaking at a panel tomorrow about the adoption of cooling paints. I know there's a bit of some of this needs to be validated. Cooling paints, apparently, if you apply it to a surface, can reduce temperatures by up to 2 degrees. And it's reportedly very cost effective, not much more expensive than your conventional paints. So for a tropical country like Singapore, it's a no-brainer, right? If I'm going to pay the same amount of money to repaint a building, why not invest in cool paints so that I can bring down and address urban heat effects? So I think there are many different ways at which the private sector can also help inform the public sector on what possible solutions are out there and how to scale. But I take cue from industry because government can't do everything. And so I listen to the finance players on what their issues are. I listen to the building and the infrastructure companies on what their issues are. I have to listen to companies when they give us feedback about our energy efficiency policies. I think that feedback loop is actually healthy, and we need a lot more of that. And I would like to believe that a platform like COP brings together very like-minded players who are quite clear that there is a way forward on a lot of these issues that we talked about. So I'll just take a pause there.
Thank you, Calvin. Government does play a central role in orchestrating many of this. Professor Goh, if I could go to you on communities, right, and community input. Are there any success stories that you could point to where it's been managed really well, right? The communities have provided input into government, into business, and the ultimate adaptation actions were much more effective. Are there examples that you can point to?
So we are working on one project in Sabah on Borneo Island. It's called Panacea. It actually means it has a very long title. It is a research project, but we aim to turn or translate the research finding into action later. So Panacea actually means a participatory approach, to nature-based solution for coastal communities in climate mitigation and adaptation. So in this project, actually, we have a few case studies across Indonesia, Philippines as well, and in Malaysia as well. But I would like to, because the project is still ongoing, and I would like to share some of the preliminary findings for the Malaysian case studies then. So what happens is that when we talk about the success, if you are talking about successful case, it is quite difficult to say whether it is successful or not, because it's that any projects at the community level, I think it's not only about at community level. Any projects have its own life cycle. Some of the stage that they are successful, but when you go to the next stage, it becomes a bottleneck. So one example is that this Darau mangrove area is a community base, but what I would say is that the enabling factors that has support, this particular community-based ecotourism as well as nature-based solutions project is that that is a huge support from the city council or City Hall of Kota Kinabalu. But that is also because there was a mandate from the government to say that we need to work with the communities. I think in Sabah, they have a very strong, I would say, it is a strong mandate, and also the governments work closely with the community. But at the moment, it's that they are successful in a way that they bring in the tourists, and then that money is actually can go into the communities to help on other areas as well when it comes to the developments or even improvement when it comes to the facilities within the villages. What's happening now is that they are having a kind of, it becomes a barrier now whereby it's that the local champion need to find some successor, the next generations to take it up, to bring these projects, this whole community's initiative to the next level. And this has been, right, a very difficult time. It is a challenge because everyone sees this, that these projects, right, is a nature-based solutions. It contributes to the local communities. But what's next? And that is very worrisome because, right, no one wants to actually take it up. Because the local peoples, the main concerns, right, it's about livelihood and can I make a living out of that? So that is one example. The other examples that we have when we are promoting about a nature-based solution, and of course in this case we are also talking about mangrove and replanting. So we have this very idealistic idea because of when we talk to the local communities, we realize that, right, there has been a history. And this is where that, right, I mean, for the social scientists, right, we use this, we employ this methodology called innovation history to trace back what happens, right, in the past and to see what is happening now. Yeah. So actually it's 3 steps, right, backwards to see what is happening now and to explain. And at the same time, we also use this methodology called NetMap, which is a network analysis, networks mapping to look at, right, who are the stakeholders involved in the nature-based solutions initiative. And that is where that, right, we could actually find out is that what is not taking place, where are the gaps, what is the strong influential stakeholders with interest. That is how it worked out. For that particular case, that is in PETAS, is that, right, in the past, because in Malaysia is that we have the gazettement of forests. So we have this conservation of forests. We have class 1, class 2, and that particular area actually, right, is class 1 forest. So the local communities in the past already have a very negative impressions towards forestry. So when we first came in, right, we talk about forests. For the communities, it's like forest equal to forestry. So it's a no. Yeah. And then later is that, right, I think so, right, from the academics is that, right, this is where that we see how research into actions is that, right, translated, is that, right, try to bridge between the government agencies and then the communities. And this is where that now it is still on, they are communicating now. Forestry is willing to work with the local communities now. Yeah, I think it's also good that we see the change. And at the same time, communities also feel that, right, yeah, they would like to work on it. And we actually bring in one more very important, right, stakeholder, which is the cooperative, what they call board, yeah, in Malaysia, because they can be the ones, right, providing funder. What's next that we are actually planning to link the whole, I mean, like, to make it an ecosystem is that how can we actually look at it from the blue carbon perspective and selling credits later, because this is, we are trying to also identify, right, the communities forest, not the ones that has been gazetted. And then when we talk about blue carbon, we are also thinking about nature-based solution. It's not only about the marine protected area, but at the same time, the ecotourism. And that is where that it will support the local people. And at the same time, it's like how we can make the tourists pay for that, which is meaningfully, can be directly, right, goes back to the community who help to protect or even live with the nature.
Thank you, Professor Goh. I loved your examples of looking backward, understanding where you came from and where you ended up here, and understanding, the overall system to be able to take the right measures, right, and unblock those bottlenecks that you said would come as the process, evolves. I'm going to do 2 more rounds of questions, Amy, Rueban, and we have time, so we're going to open it up to the audience, for any of your questions, anything that you would love to engage on with this esteemed panel. Maybe Amy, starting with you. You talked about lack of vulnerability maps and the data behind it that limits some level of decision making. You also described the blind spots in supply chains, in selected industries. If you look ahead, what needs to happen and what needs to be done for the appropriate conditions to be there for businesses to take commercial decisions on adaptation actions?
So the first thing is ownership. I think often when it comes to resilience, organizations don't often have one clear owner. You can see the CEO owns all the risks. But the chief risk officer may not be thinking about the physical resilience. Supply chain and procurement are often more focused on contracting. The insurance manager is often thinking about the own asset footprint. And so what we find often when you think about the entire ecosystem within which a company operates, so their owned assets, their workers, their customers, their supply chains, I find that there is rarely one point of accountability that feels as if they own that problem. Because I think absent that, it's very, very hard, because the amount of stakeholder alignment that's needed internally, let alone all the external stakeholders and expertise that's needed. So ownership within the organization. And I think with that, if there is an owner that is really invested in addressing these problems, then they will send the demand signal for the data that will resolve the rest of the problems. Because the private sector is very good at responding to a demand signal. So if there was a consistent demand signal for better vulnerability data within ASEAN, it would be developed, because it's an evolution of something that exists elsewhere. So I think if I get one thing, it's a point of responsibility and accountability within the corporates.
Thanks, Amy. One follow-up question. Do we have all the tools that we need, or is there more tooling that's required?
So I loved your question to Professor Goh about nature-based solutions. So if we had the vulnerability maps, then I would know for construction types here, I would know how building materials responded differently to different hazards. I would know how roofing materials responded differently. I would have all of that information. And that's doable. What we are least good at is understanding the impact or quantifying the impact of nature-based solutions on the hazard mitigation from an insurance perspective. We can see from hydrologically, we can see nature-based solutions that are providing buffering capacity, or they're slowing the flow. But we don't yet have consistent, mature models that can turn that into a dollar consequence from an insurance perspective.
Thanks, Amy. That's a nice segue into going back to nature. So one of the areas that we've looked at to mobilize more investment and financing into adaptation is the idea of stacking on, different benefits, right? Adaptation, mitigation benefits, social benefits, and some of which you can even put revenue streams against, right? And then you can have private sector invest against it, you can get financing and so on. And you've been involved at the heart of carbon markets for a long time. Are there any learnings, lessons, or maybe even pitfalls that one could take away as we think about adaptation finance?
Thanks, Dave. And if you'll allow me, I'll digress a little bit. So before we even came to COP, my communications head, and then she's sitting right here, was like, oh, Rueban, whenever you're on a panel, whenever you're on a media, it's great. You should tell stories because you're good at storytelling, And she said that because usually when I am on panels, I'm like, we have 3 points, first point, second point, third point, right? It's a very Singaporean thing, right? But Heron, I've already said 2 stories, so I'm going to go back to my 3 points. So, and the starting point, Dave, for me is recognizing that we are well beyond mitigation. That's not saying that we shouldn't still work to mitigate and drive down emissions and reach global net zero. But we have emitted too much that we have to adapt. And that must be the starting point. But then there's a fundamental problem, and this is a problem that comes up every COP in the last 5 COPs I've attended, right? Which is there's not enough funding going to adaptation. So the problem, the question then is, how do you increase funding flows to adaptation? And I'm no finance expert, nor am I an adaptation expert. So I'll just share 3 things that I've seen that sets us in the right direction. The first is creating the rules and the guidelines to do so. I think one example is it was shared this morning by the Minister of Sustainability of Singapore as well, where the Singapore government has invested in a mitigation project overseas, carbon crediting or not. The 5% of that proceeds is mandated to be set aside to adaptation. So that's one way you do it. You set rules, you set guidelines that say that, okay, you have to have mitigation and adaptation in the same vein, and until the market realizes that, regulation comes in and sets the direction. The second example that I've seen is by incorporating it as a key design element. And I'll cite a WWF example. So in WWF, it's quite rare that we just look at a project as a project itself. A fundamental philosophy in a lot of the work that WWF does is in working in landscapes. And by working in landscapes and not just looking at a project, whether it's a mitigation or adaptation project, you break those boundaries of mitigation versus adaptation. And I'll give you a live example, and also so I tell a bit of stories, right? So WWF in Asia Pacific works in this landscape called the Sulu-Sulawesi landscape, which is a coral triangle. And it is a landscape that cuts across Malaysia, among other countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And why that corridor is important is because it's an ecological corridor where turtles travel. Not only turtles, but dolphins as well travel, and communities used to travel as well. So there's a lot of historical significance. And when we look at projects there, and WWF works in currently more than seven sites within those landscapes, right? And when we're looking at adaptation projects, we are like, okay, how can we work at adaptation projects or mitigation projects within those landscapes to create those synergistic benefits? But you can only do that when you're looking at the landscape level and not at the project level, right? So that's the second element, which is incorporating and breaking that boundary by rethinking how you design programs, right? And moving away from a project level basis. The third, and I think Amy alluded to this and shared quite a fair bit on this, is creating the business case. And Dave, you shared about carbon markets, and I think blue carbon came about in what Prof Goh mentioned as well. And I'll give you two examples of how in carbon markets there has been a business case that has been created for adaptation. The first is through the incorporation of rating agencies. So for some context, to those that are not familiar with the carbon market space, it's a growing trend in carbon markets for projects to be given ratings. And these ratings are like your financial services. You get a AA, double B, a triple C, depending on how good your project is. And Prof Goh shared about mangrove projects. In mangrove project, there was a project that was rated a triple B. And the reason why it was rated a triple B was not because it does not remove carbon, but because it was susceptible to sea level rise that would affect its ability to store the carbon in the future. So there is then a commercial incentive, and at the same time, you have projects, and the projects are in Malaysia, for example, that are AA, because the projects by design have factored in modeling of sea level rise. And the difference between a AA and a triple B project is a range between 20 to 40% more price that you can sell the credit for. So as a project developer, and WWF is not a project developer for avoidance of doubt, there is a commercial incentive for you to break the boundaries of adaptation and mitigation. And another example is insurance. So also looking at projects, right? There is a cost to insurance in carbon markets, for example, if you don't mitigate a project, because, and that is a non-trivial cost. Insurance costs can incur up to 10 to 15% of the project cost. If you're not able to effectively show how you have mitigated the natural risk. So there is a real commercial incentive for project developers to mitigate that risk upfront, that the adaptation, or to introduce the adaptation element upfront, because there is a true business case to do that, right? So I think these are three examples that I've seen of ways in which the boundaries are broken and the lines are blurred between this, to be frank, very artificial distinction between mitigation and adaptation, which is a construct of the UNFCCC, right? It is a construct of the Paris Agreement because we needed three goals: adaptation, mitigation, and finance, right? So, but there's no strong reason why that barriers need to happen in practice and in implementation as well.
Fantastic examples, Ruben. And I think you met your objectives on storytelling. I think they were very good. Thank you for sharing that. It was fantastic. I can't help myself, but I have to say that we have to keep a very strong focus on a mitigation pathway because, you know, certain adaptation solutions will just not be effective in the more severe scenarios, right? You said 5-meter sea level rise. Yeah. I think an 8-meter storm surge will be a different thing to engineer against, right? So we gotta keep the eye on mitigation certainly as well as adaptation. So we have some time. Would love to open it up to the audience, you know, to engage on this topic. Anyone has any questions, comments, reflections, thoughts to add, you know, please feel free. I think we have some mics floating around also. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jean-Axel Poté, typical French name, sorry. And I'm coming from Ivory Coast, which is a specific landscape. My question is to Madame Amy Barnes. You described the case of insurances. You explain the industry. You give a lot of examples. And I just wanted to understand how, because I couldn't picture it, how maybe the SMEs, because we have a lot of SMEs in Ivory Coast. I would like to know how the SMEs might intervene in this particular setting, because my company worked on a project. I don't know if you know Scala. Land use, it's a land use and integration of the private sector. And I kind of understood that the SMEs and then all the small actors from the private sector might be quite helpful in that particular, in those adaptation aspect. So I would like to know if there is any rooms for SMEs, because we do work a lot with SMEs.
I think a lot of the work is being done by SMEs. And if we think about the innovation that's happening around both mitigation and adaptation, I was on a panel yesterday about wildfire where the rain came in. So it was quite ironic. But if I think about a lot of the innovation in the wildfire space, the majority there is happening with tech startups, with small and medium enterprises. So I don't think there's any barrier to this space for small companies. I think the challenge for any small business is getting your capabilities known and understood. And so if there is a specific capability that you have that can reduce the risk, then making sure that the insurance company is aware of that capability and how they can quantify the benefit that it brings. But there is no barrier to small companies intervening in this space, because I think all the panelists have said not all of the interventions that we need are engineering solutions. The engineering solutions will largely be with the architects and the large engineering firms, but I think everyone would rather that our solutions have as little cement as possible. One thing we haven't done, I can't believe we haven't mentioned this panel, is what an amazing job Singapore has done of being one of the spongiest cities out there. I mean, you've been thinking about water for a very, very long time. And so as we see more cities focusing on sponginess, which hopefully everybody's, the water, the land being able to take more water, real challenge for us in the UK, where the richer you get, the more you want to pave over every single centimetre of green space that you have. And so there's plenty of scope for actors of all sizes to intervene and make a difference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Oh.
Hello, thank you for hearing me now. It's just a comment about it's really good to see so many perspectives how the public and private service can offer to help the communities and the cities in situations of flood, because I'm a natural born person from here, from Pará. I've been living here for all my life. I am accustomed to, and all of the people who live here, accustomed to with the situations of flood around the streets, around the poor communities, which is the ribeirinhos. We see so much, and we are being accustomed to just deal with it, not actually have solutions along decades and decades. I have families who have been born and grew old dealing with this, just saying that's how that's how thing it is in Belem. So it's really interesting to see how the public and private service sees the situations, how you deal and see how the cost and how difficult and harsh it really is to see, but it really is something I could call enlightenment for me, who has been living here for so many years, and see so many people close to me dealing and having lost and losing your houses, having so many hardships to do in your daily life. And it is really a really great assessment for me to see and hear our professionals and your and colleagues and having a say about this. It really says a lot about the future that I could foresee for this, for my city, and for all I could say it about in the near future.
Thank you for. Do you want to come in? Well, thank you for sharing. I would say that the similarities are remarkable, right, between Belem, this area, and Southeast Asia. I mean, even if you look out, you see the mangroves; they look very similar. So we live in a very similar environment, and unfortunately, we're dealing with similar issues, right? And much to be done.
Dave, I was just going to say, related to your comment, it's just my reflection is that I believe that the state of Para and the city of Belem should be really proud of what you've done for COP30, because it is a huge achievement, and everything that we see here being put up and being run in a sustainable manner, it's really impressive. So it gives me a lot of hope as well, that the young people are committed and the city is committed to make this happen.
And I can only echo that. I mean, it's really amazing job that Belem has done. Question.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Sunita Singh. I'm representing the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice out of New Orleans, another city really struggling with this need for sponginess. One, I feel like we're really behind the curve, like Singapore, among other cities, have put, at this point, decades into addressing infrastructure. We're in a scenario where we're losing our dollars for infrastructure. We're also in an emergency where several of our insurers have left the region, and the federal government is not coming in and standing in with a strong set of residential commercial insurers. So I'm at this place now where we're trying to understand new and innovative ways to finance our work on addressing coastal erosion, creating more spongy spaces, but also getting the population more aware of how to move and live with water. I'm curious, what are your thoughts for a city to come and learn? Come and, adopt us, be our uncle and auntie in this process.
Thank you for the reflection and also for the question. Maybe Calvin, as the government representative.
No, first and foremost, I have utmost respect for the city of New Orleans. I think the way you have responded to many of the incidents over the past few years has been very brave and commendable. I know there were some headwinds, and I think the world stands with you to make sure that you're able to pull through and thrive actually in this climate impaired world. What I think I would say is that it's never too late to start. Singapore, we are a young country, and really a lot of the lessons are quite hard fought and learned along the way. We have our own share of mistakes. And I think your presence here at COP is really an indictment of what Singapore has done as well. We try to learn from others. So in our early days, when we were struggling with not just inland flooding, we had struggled with access to clean water. So we had to learn how to make sure that we converted pretty much more than half our island into a catchment area, pretty much, right? We created reservoirs where there were none. There were man-made reservoirs. We converted certain coastal areas that were exposed to seawater, and we sealed it up to create new reservoirs. And when technology was available, we went into desalination, reverse osmosis. So that journey was with its own share of ups and downs. And we benefited, I think, from the experience of others and learned from others. So that's, I think, a great starting point, that we can always learn from one another. Secondly, I think we all have to find new and innovative ways to and contextualize these global solutions then to our local context. I think some of that means our communities have to understand that it comes with some sacrifice, right? So again, in the early days of Singapore, we had to go through water rationing. I know this is something that may not be close to, I guess, younger Singaporeans' minds, but I remember when I was very young, we had to do deliberate water rationing. So we learned that water is precious, and that there may come a time where we don't have access to regular clean water at the on of a tap. And so I think having that resilience, that grit, to know that nothing you can't take anything for granted, and that you can try your best, but actually the community needs to come together is just as important. And lastly, I'll just make a point that you talk about adopting, but one way to think about it is just an extension of learning from one another. I'm very sure we're happy to learn from the New Orleans as well. I understand that several years ago, the Public Utilities Board of Singapore actually went to New Orleans to learn from you on how you dealt with the floods. And I'm quite sure that we're happy to reciprocate if New Orleans would like to have a visit to us. Take a look at our detention tanks. Take a look at how we perhaps integrate some of the inland coastal flooding with the inland flooding as well as coastal flooding, and how they interact with one another. That is an emerging model that we are building. If that's something that you're keen to understand a bit more, I think there's so much that we can learn from one another. And I'm sure many in the audience too will be happy to share their experience.
May I just add one point that I feel so passionately about, and we had a report published in the UK just last week. In the UK, 1 in 13 homes is still being built on a floodplain. And we need to stop building badly. And I think that's one thing that won't necessarily be politically convenient, but to stop homes and buildings being built in the wrong place and to the wrong standard. Yeah, we need to do it.
Thank you, Calvin and Amy. A really important point that you made. We'll do one more question and then we'll do rounding thoughts from everyone. Any final question or reflection?
Thanks. After the floods, coming the epidemics like malaria or dengue, no? So that's if that sounds supports that's epidemics. I don't know. I need more information about that.
So my sister company is thinks about health and people, and it is Actually, I should probably defer to government because government are taking this very seriously, both in the immediate aftermath and also the long-term climate change. What does that mean for zoonotic diseases generally? How do our health systems adapt? And we're already seeing that generally the costs of, I'm afraid my data is US because that's where we have the best data, but we're already seeing the specific increase in healthcare costs due to climate change, and we can already quantify them, and it goes into the tens of billions of dollars. And so I don't think there is an answer other than the healthcare providers and the government is part of the integrated approach that's being looked at to make sure that the medical services are ready to respond. But I think you'd probably give a better answer.
I think you raise a very pertinent point. In Singapore, we face a very similar issue. With the increase in heat and the increase in flooding, we are already seeing an uptick in zoonotic diseases, as what you have mentioned. So we are engaging with the health authorities we call this a One Health concept, where we ask the health authorities to incorporate all these different climate impacts. So increase in heat, what are those interaction effects with vulnerable populations, for example, the young, the old, those with perhaps some kind of a physical disability, they may affect their different physiological reactions to heat. And in a flooding scenario, which I think is a bit less so in Singapore, but still quite pertinent, what again are the public health responses to that? So for sure, I think governments have a part to play in this and the public health system. But I would think in many different nations, you have a very specific local and community knowledge and response that actually governments need to learn from. We have lost some of that, unfortunately, in Singapore with urbanization especially. But I would like to believe in many other countries where actually the risk of flooding, then you see an uptick of zoonotic diseases. I would say pay attention, and many of the panelists have mentioned nature-based solutions, but I will also say local responses and community responses. And I think we need to be sensitive to that, and where it works, then we should actually more actively resource and actually scale those responses.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the response. As an aside, we've been working with a few developing economies on the adaptation programs, and that's been a consistent forward projection that the tropical disease incident rates are expected to increase with the heat and the flooding. Right? So I think this is a common theme everywhere. Unfortunately, I think we're almost on time, so we're gonna maybe just wrap up with some final thoughts. One or two takeaways, from each of you, and then we'll close it off there. Rueban.
Thanks, Dave. And it's a bit of so my final thought would be a bit of what I shared earlier, which is about the importance of breaking boundaries and breaking artificial boundaries. Right. So, to not see things as a mitigation action, adaptation action, but to frame it as what we often do in WWF, not that it's the right way, but it helps us frame things, is a balance between society, economy, and ecology. Right? And when we see things as a holistic system, an ecosystem, then we can start dealing with problems also in a more holistic way.
Thank you, Rueban. Professor Goh?
So I have been talking a lot about nature-based solutions, but to be realistic, it's that right, nature-based solution might not be the only solutions for some of the area has been highly eroded, for instance. But that is where we need a hybrid solutions with the aid of technology as well as what we call the IGGI, the integrated greening of grey infrastructure. I think all these should be used together. And one thing that I really like to advocate is also about ecosystem services, where we see that is where we see the multiple purpose of design. When we talk about nature-based solution, we are not only tackling about the provisioning or regulating, but at the same time the connections that is through the cultural ecosystem services as well.
Thank you. Calvin?
I think my reflection, because we talked a lot about adaptation financing, especially in the Southeast Asia region, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think a lot of what we talked about are tools and processes that we are already familiar with. We talk about carbon rating agencies. Well, that's modeled after what we do in the financial services sector already. We talk about hazards and vulnerability assessments. Well, we already do that in the daily work that we do. So I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to apply our minds to what perhaps are some of these gaps that we discussed, and then see how we can address those. So that gives me hope that actually we are not talking about coming together and creating a vastly new or very different ecosystem. We already have the building blocks that resides in each and every one of our domains of expertise. And that's why we're coming together to figure a way forward.
Amy, final word.
So I'm going to stick with the private sector theme. I think it's really easy for the topics we're talking about to feel very overwhelming. And so I always like to come back to, like, what's the one thing I can do? And for anybody in the audience who works in the private sector, talk to your procurement team and tell them to put in their tenders that you need every single tender response to tell you how you invest in resilience and how you quantify resilience, because that sends a message to CEOs that this matters and it's important. And I promise you, you don't need anyone's permission to do it.
Thank you, Amy. Great way to end. Well, thank you all. It's been an excellent discussion. Love the examples, the stories, and the specificity that we got to. And thank you to the audience for joining. Thank you for your participation. Wish you a great rest of the evening and a productive and a COP that advances forward. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you to our panelists for the rich exchange so far. Perhaps we can have all the speakers on stage, remain on stage for a group photo. I hope their insights have shared, the insights that has been shared reflect a clear message. The risks of inaction are escalating, but so is the region's readiness to collaborate, innovate, and lead. Oh, one more for the phone. As we wrap up, I would like to thank our speakers, panelists, and all of you for joining us today. We hope this conversation inspires further partnerships and deeper engagement with the SEAPAW team. The speakers will be hanging around for a little while, so if any of you would like to have a private conversation with them, you can do so. And also, since we're on the topic of water, we have our new beer, New brew, yes, where Singapore uses recycled used water. We clean it, you make it potable again, and we actually turn it into beer. It's really good, so please have a try at our counter there. So thank you once again, and please enjoy the rest of your time here at COP30.